Ladies and gentlemen, let's get ready to rumble!
We're going to go ahead and get started, and other people might be popping in. That's fine. We're going to be super casual. We will not be actually wrestling each other or fighting today.
Sorry to disappoint.
I mean, maybe. I mean, you don't want to tell about the last time that happened, Chris.
Yeah, no, I'll save that
You had
for
a lot of explaining to do.
Yeah.
So, as you guys can imagine, right? Like, we're in the trenches every single day as realtors, and as some of you are buyers, right? And it really sometimes feels like a wrestling match or the boxing ring, because in this crazy extreme sellers market, these buyers, right, like they're getting knocked out. And every day we see it and we feel it. And we just started having this conversation about, you know what, it would probably be smart if we just got in a forum like this and just said, hey, let's talk through what's happening right now in this market. We've all, you know, the wonderful thing about our world at Keller Williams is we are a great company. We all work together and support each other as agents. So it's awesome to see a lot of our fellow realtors on this call. We've got some past clients, some current buyers, and we really just want to have an open conversation about what this market looks like, so we can all be in lock pace and make sure that we're all educating you and you're getting the things that you want. Because I've been in real estate a long time, right? Collectively, I think we could probably, that number is really, really big. And we've seen lots of up markets and down markets. This is a different kind of market. And none of us would have ever guessed that we would be sitting where we're sitting right now, but it's reality. And while we're in the trenches every day, boxing through it, a lot of the public doesn't know what we know and doesn't see what we see. And we get a lot of information about the high level of frustration that the buyers have, right? Because Chris, how are sellers feeling about this market?
They're feeling amazing unless they need to buy something. But even then, if they're doing both, they feel really good about it. And certainly when that phone call and we lead with sellers of, are you sitting down? Some markets that's actually, you're saying that because it's not so good news, but really in the last 3 years, and who would have thought this year even more so than last year or the year prior, sellers are having an awesome go of it, specifically in the western suburbs in DuPage and King counties. So yeah, it's a great time to be a seller. Tougher time to be a buyer, but that does not mean it's not the right time to buy for you. So
exactly. And that the question we get all the time is it a right time to buy? Is it the right time to sell? And the answer is never simple. It really depends on you, what every piece of the puzzle of your life looks like. And in any market, it's always a good time to buy or sell, depending on how educated you are. So we find ourselves joking around a lot, because if you aren't laughing, you're crying sometimes in this market. So we like to have a lot of fun and kind of kid about it, but we really did want to get real and get right about what is happening in the market. Because if you are a buyer right now, and maybe you don't have access to the right information, or you're not working with the right realtor, or maybe you're just confused, it can be really difficult. Right. So we just kind of walk you through like, hey, this is the reality of the situation. Let's talk through some pro tips on it. Let's just get educated. And then I would love to open it up to any questions that the buyers out there have, or if you're considering buying or selling, or whatever that looks like. So just wanted to kind of set the table on that, and then we can kind of dive right into it. Wanted to talk first just a little bit about the market and where we're at. We invited Todd, our lender partner, to chat with us for a little bit today, and just give us just a bottom line on where are we in the market. Tell us about mortgage starts, tell us about historical data, so we can just get a really quick Reader's Digest view of what we're sitting at right now.
Wow. Okay. Well, thanks for having me on. I much appreciate it. And, you know, there's a housing cycle happens quite frequently, right? And people don't realize that sometimes we cycle in and out of this market very easily, and sometimes more difficult. That's the nicest way of saying it, I think. You know, and I think that the thing that we have to keep in perspective when you start talking about the state of Illinois, most people will always talk about how everybody's exiting. Well, that's contrary to what the inventory shares with us right now, is that not many people, if they're exiting, they're filling those houses very quickly right now, right?
Yes.
So just know that when we start talking about, I think one of the most common questions of 3 that I'm asked about all the time is, are values going to decline? Are we going to see a massive decline in value? And I'm like, well, maybe. Here's what I would tell you though, is as other states around the country are declining, if we look at the top 10 metro areas in the United States, Illinois is in the top 3 of actually continuing to be stable as far as market value.
Wait a minute. Wait, what? Illinois is at the top of the list for something positive?
Yes, indeed. How about
Never.
that? Yes. Isn't that fascinating?
What about low taxes? How do we do on that ranking?
Well, that's another topic we're going to
Okay,
do today.
I was getting a little ahead of myself. Okay, that's exciting
I think
news.
the other thing that people need to know about Illinois, when you start measuring the states around the country, Illinois is one of the top 10 states in the country in appreciated value since all this started. And it's also one of the top 5 states of not having a declining value. So Chicagoland traditionally, if you don't know, for decades has been very strong in the real estate market in a way where we have diversity, not only in jobs, but in people in all certain sectors of the business world, that we usually come in very, very stable, even going through the Great Recession of 07 through probably 2012, 13. Yes, there was decline in values, but it was nothing like what the rest of the country saw. And I think the other thing everybody needs to remember is that each state or each region of the country may cycle through a housing market completely differently than a different region of the country. So we are certainly not the far west. We are certainly not the southwest. We're certainly not the South Florida. We are doing really, really strongly in this market of maintaining values and not seeing significance in declines. And if you look at it year over year, we're up $17,000 in home equity than we were a year ago. Isn't that interesting?
That's really interesting. That's very significant, especially as people say, are we going to have a foreclosure market? Are we going to go into short sales again like 2010? No, different. We have too much money, right? We have a lot of cash.
Well, wealth in real estate has never been greater ever in history. So the amount of homes that have equity in the US is significant, more so than you could ever imagine.
And,
so if I said
we're feeling that in Chicago. Is that kind of just to put a bow on what you're saying? We're seeing that even more in our area than in other parts of the country.
Correct. Most so, yes. I mean, equity is definitely there right now for the not only Chicagoland, but the state of Illinois in general. So that's a fantastic thing to remember. And I think that when you start thinking about housing inventory, it's also interesting to think about that when you start looking at the generation that really has been sidelined for the last 3 or 4 years of those baby boomers and that older generation, they have very, very little to do with what's going on because they haven't sold their houses yet. We're talking about significance in that age group that has not sold their houses back into the market yet. And when you look at it statistically, going into this year through 2030, they believe over the next 5 to 6 years, over 55% of people over the age of 55 will be renting and selling all those houses back into the market. Think about that.
Wow.
Those are major league numbers when you think about it. And the other interesting thing is the average buyer 10 years ago was 25 years old.
Okay.
Prior to the Great Recession. So we even go to the tail end of 13 back into 2010 in that area. The average person this year will hit 36 years old for buying their first home.
Really?
So,
wow.
So when you start measuring how long people stay in houses, I mean, it was once said that the average person will buy or sell 7 times in a lifetime, right? That is different now. So that means that if somebody's average age is 36 and people are statistically over the next 7 years, 50% going to be selling their homes, we are going to see inventory coming back to the market. It is not being snapped away like it once was. Now, let's not mistake what we're going through right now. We obviously have an issue with inventory, right? And I'm sure that Carie or Chris, you could comment on that a little bit. But statistically, if you start looking at the numbers, we are definitely trending in the right direction. We have been in a housing recession now, and I really believe that we are rolling out of that housing recession more strongly than what we've seen. When you start looking at mortgage applications and you start looking at people locking loans, it's up 7.2% just from last month. That's a big number, considering prior to the month of May, it was declining. So people are definitely entering the market. People are definitely selling their homes that they had at 2.5% to 3.5%, buying a house at 6.5% to 7% because they need to do it. And that's just the way it is. And I think the thing we need to keep in mind with interest rates is, historically speaking, if the interest rates are 6 3/4 today, we're still below the trend line to the average interest rate over the course of time.
Right.
Right.
That's an interesting thing to look at. It feels painful, but when you take the emotion out of it and logically look at where the trend lines hit, we're actually right on pace.
Absolutely.
Todd, I have a question on that while I think of it, is because our focus today is how to win in this market as a buyer. And I'm seeing, like you said, we're now seeing that competition is picking up with the increase in mortgage applications. I'm curious, and I'm kind of putting you on the spot. We haven't talked about this before now, but you're good at this stuff. Is there a stat around how many people are exiting the market, like have given up hope? And maybe that stat is, pre-approvals that have gone expired, past their life. Is there a stat like that we see how many people are kind of
That's a
backing
good
off
question.
to know what's the real pool?
Well, I think you have two ways of looking at the pool. You have one side of it saying, are we seeing an increase in inventory, right? So we can talk about that. But then there's also the topic of what they call pull-through rate. And pull-through rate is nothing more than a mathematical equation saying that this person locked and committed to a contract and the person never fulfilled the contract. So that is what they call pull-through rate in the finance world, because pull-through rate's important, because if you lock a rate and you never close it, then it's subject to being a loss in the marketplace. So when I look at it, it's a determinator for me to say, are people closing or are people not closing their loans, right? And that gives me a really good indication of if pull-through is very high, that means people, no matter what or regardless of the house, are sticking with it and closing their homes. Whereas if not, we're saying, oh, people are walking away because they didn't like something with the house or an inspection issue or it praised too little, whatever the case may be. There's 50 different barometers of how that may work. But right now we're seeing pull through extremely high. Extremely high in the market, right? So we're seeing very few deals kind of separate and walk away from one another, which tells us that we're seeing very little cancellations of contracts and very little cancellations of rate locks. So that's a very important number to understand.
I love
that
that
might be due to that. Oh, sorry, Carie. I was going to say that might be due to the fact that they won after writing 4 offers. The house they ended up winning had 9 other offers. And they just know they can't afford to walk away from this if they truly need a bigger home, smaller home, a home, whatever the case may be. They just know it's too risky to go revisit things more times than not.
Probably so. Yeah, all that, absolutely. And obviously the way we look at appraisals nowadays are a little bit different than we looked at them 5 years ago with appraisal gaps and all those things. People are closing homes now because you're right. When you see lack of inventory, you would expect that number to go up. And when you see a normal inventory, you would see it starting to settle into a more common number of a 65 to 75% pull through.
And I think when we first started this, when the rates started to, go up and up to handle that inflation issue that we were having, I think people kept thinking we're going to wait and it's going to go right back down. And so now that we're getting comfortable to say, well, it doesn't look like that's happening, right? It's all about, emotion and logic. We always talk about that in real estate. When emotion goes up, logic goes down. And so we have to really create a lot of data for our buyers. So because in their experience, if this is the second time they've ever bought a home, the first time that they bought, it may have been a completely different scenario where they were in the driver's seat. They were driving the terms. They were driving the price. And this might feel very foreign and uncomfortable to them. And so what we have to do is logically explain what this looks like by bringing in, right? You need a team, you need a panel of people that can sit here and tell you, this is what's happening. So like, what is the cost of waiting for that rate to go down, right? Should we have that magic ball and we fast forward 1 year and we say, okay, the rates never went down. What do we know then would likely happen with pricing?
Right. Yep. Yep. And I think the other thing that people need to know is the housing recession always comes before an economic recession. And believe it or not, the economic recession is part of the healing power of the housing market getting started again. So when you
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah. So when you look at where we're at today, is our highest inflation number was in June of last year. Just remember is that inflation tracks back 12 months. And the reason that inflation rate was so high is because food and energy costs went through the roof. We remember when eggs were $2.99 a dozen. Now they're whatever they are a dozen, or gas or what it was, right? So just remember is we have May, June falling off this next month, which will see a decline in the inflation rate likely. And what that means to everyone on the call is when inflation declines, so will mortgage rates. Mortgage rates will typically, historically, always follow. So when you say to somebody today, the question every day is like, okay, so if I buy today, what does that look like for my future? Well, your future is likely, honestly, in the next 12 months, likely you're going to refinance out of this mortgage rate anyway, to be very honest with you, because you can't have declining values in economics moving towards, even if it's a very, very soft recession that no one recognizes we're in, it's still going to bring down interest rates. Because what took interest rates way up was uncertainty of the pandemic and also the inflation rate. So those two things that have uncertainty really have not helped the mortgage or the real estate industry at this point in time. But we are on the precipice of everything shifting back the other direction. And I think everybody needs to know that.
Yeah, well, supply and demand drives everything. And so I'll be honest with you, I'm not a big fan of the marry the house, date the rate.
Yeah, right.
I mean, it's cutesy or whatever, but I think that seems a little risky and a little reckless to be, having that kind of, because we don't know what the future is gonna, we just have to figure out what the cost of waiting would be, and we sort of monitor what that risk looks like. And if the rates don't change, then we know we're happy to buy today. It was a good choice. If the rates do change, right, for good or for ill, that refinancing option is available. So, I think what we want to, continue the conversation around is like, what are we seeing? How can we help buyers? Educate them. What's in your best interest when you're buying to feel good about the purchase? I mean, Chris, Stacy, like we would be a very entertaining reality show, hands down, to follow us around and to hear the things that we hear. Right now, keep in mind, we also list an awful lot of property and we help buyers buy an awful lot of property. So we are seeing both sides of this coin, and we know how to educate our buyers because we are savvy listers as well. So let's kind of jump into that. Chris, are you cool with kind of talking a little bit about what is actually happening in the market? I mean, when we have a situation where a couple of weeks ago we had a home, we had over 50 showings, 12 offers, right? Like, it's a sale, a seller's dream, but like, let's flip side that. Like, what is an important factor for the buyers to think about as far as like communication and what they have to be ready for?
Yeah, I mean, I think the foundation of this is the communication, because it's such a volatile market and you can go weeks without seeing any homes and then, see 3 homes in one day and have to be ready to pull the trigger and make an offer. There's just really not a lot of dilly-dallying going on as a buyer right now. And so I think it's critical to be in lockstep with your agent as well as your lender. And Todd, I'm curious to get your thoughts on how your buyers communicate with your team, especially if it's been a month or 2 or even longer since you've connected with them. Because we find a lot of times is that a buyer all of a sudden resurfaces 6 months later. They haven't talked to their lender since we last talked to them. And now we got to get pre-approved and we're rush. And sometimes we don't make the deadline or whatever the case may be. But, making sure that if your needs and desires change, you're communicating that with both your realtor and your lender. But also making sure you're over communicating. It's a two-way street for us to distribute houses, try to find off-market properties, work the private listing network, all these areas. On the flip side, it's big for the buyers to engage with us as well and let us know what's exciting them, where they're at. And it's important also for us to ask that, how are you feeling about this? Because it is an emotional process. And when you have to make a decision in less than 24 hours, you want to make sure that buyer's remorse doesn't creep in and that they're ultimately satisfied through the process. So Todd, I don't know if you want to speak to the best practices for buyers from the lender perspective on how they reach out to you, stay informed, to understand what the rates are and how that fits into their budget.
And before you do, like, fair to say, gone are the days of, I'm going to go see the house. I'll call my lender if I like it. Or, gone are the days of, well, if it, it just listed, let's wait a week and see what happens.
Amen. Yes. I mean, I agree with what both you're saying, especially on the idea of marry the house and date the rate, because it's so important, the communication. If I have someone coming to me, it's really a real conversation that we want to set up to understand their needs, why they're doing it, what we can do to help them. It's really coming to understand them as a family and the purpose behind why they're going through this experience, because they typically will have lots of questions, right? And so that's important to me, is we have to be as interested as possible in them and what their needs are, so we have an understanding of what they're looking to do. Because a lot of times I had one this morning, hey, we're not going to buy for 6 months yet. So I understand that may happen sooner or later, right? So, I always prepare the client to go, earlier is better, preparing is better, right? So let's prepare, let's paint that financial picture. Let's come to a really great understanding of your need. That way that you and I and your agent can all kind of conversate on the same level is the best way for saying it.
And
Right?
a seller's agent's not even going to look at an offer if it doesn't have a current pre-approval letter or proof of funds or something like that. So no point in even writing an offer if we can't really be solid with the way the home is going to be financed.
Right.
Right. So doing that on the day of or something like that is also not the best practice. If you don't mind, just quickly educate us about the difference between a pre-approval, pre-approval, and pre-approval.
Yes. So a pre-dash approval is nothing more than what an old pre-qualification was. It's basically painting the financial picture, validating assets, validating income, and then running it through what they call the automated underwriting system provided by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. That is traditional. It's been that way for a very, very long time, and that's okay. But in this market, when it is this competitive, there is a next place you can go, which is a pre-approval without a dash. A lot of people don't know there's two different ways of talking about that. And a pre-approval without a dash is where we want to get every client every day, is to get to the point where they're actually underwriting the file without having an address, without having an interest rate. Because by doing so, within a very short time, you can be fully approved, subject to title and appraisal, technically if they wanted to close within 15 days or less. So if you're walking in and with Chris or Carie, and you have a letter saying, listen, this is completely cleared to close other than the title and appraisal, and the appraisal may not even be necessary nowadays, right? If that's the case, if we can get a title in 5 days, that's a really great opportunity for Carie or Chris to present something that they already know it's completely done. There's no hiccups, there's no problems, everything's been finished. That is where the level of expectation should be with every buyer. I want to get to that place because it's going to create the best opportunity for me to win.
How many times, Chris, do we get buyers that just come to us out of pure frustration that say, I've written 10 offers, I've not gotten anywhere, right? And these are the nuances that the public needs to know about to make sure that your offer is going to be strong. And then that is a very small nuance, but how important is it, especially as agents? It's our job to educate not only our clients, but their agent around, this is what this means for your seller, right? This is a strong offer. This is stronger than pre-dash approval, right? Who knew that tiny little nuance could be so important? But these are the things that, most agents or most buyers just don't think about. It's really the details are what are winning these, major bidding wars. So I think that's super important. Having all your ducks in a row, right, is super important, and having those conversations so you're prepared. Everything has to happen ahead of time. And so that piece of communication is really important. I mean, back in the day, right, it would be very casual. We would date the homes for a long time, right? This is like 90 Day Fiance, right? We're coming in and it's always a relationship analogy in real estate, right? Like it never fails. So that is always how it goes. So, so communication is important, right? Making sure that, you're understanding, and really, I mean, I know this is an age-old thing to say, but a home is really worth what a buyer is willing to pay for it. And so we really get caught up and hung up on price and what price should be and what price was and what price could possibly be in the future. And although all those things are important, that's also very emotional. And so we have to look at the bigger picture and what does this home mean to you? How long are you going to be in it? Right? Like all those other pieces of the puzzle when we're talking about price. And so, Chris, if you could jump into like we're talking about just what you want versus what you need.
Yep. Yeah, I think knowing what you want and what you need in a home is big. What can you live without? What's more important, having 4 bedrooms because you have 2 kids and you want a space for guests or you need an office, or wanting a nice deck or, to not be landlocked with homes behind you in your backyard. So I think those expectations are clear, and that communication, even within a household, can be big when it comes to buyers. So spouses and just, boyfriend, girlfriend, whatever the case may be, if you're buying a home with someone other than yourself and kids under the age of 15, then you have to be on the same page with that. And then that leads right into budget, which ultimately determines how much you're willing to spend on a home. And so as rates go up or down, maybe you're getting a pay raise at work, there's so many different factors, and we always lean on the lending side and Todd and his team to help put the financial pieces on the table. But in addition to that, it's then ultimately time to write the offer, find the house and write the offer, and determine how much you're going to, put in your offer. And so one component to that, I've run more CMAs for buyers this year by far and away than sellers. I look at some of my clients, I've actually sent them 5 or 6 CMAs on properties we've seen, and they're the buyer. And that's to
And a
help us
CMA is,
comparative market analysis. So for our buyers, this is important. They're always wondering, well, I don't want to be the idiot that buys this house for way more than anybody ever has in the history. And we're seeing neighborhoods throughout Canyon DuPage County where it's the highest sale or the top 3 highest sales in the history of the entire subdivision. And we're talking about subdivisions that have been around in Geneva 20 plus years, St. Charles 30, 40 years. And people, that makes them nervous. So that's where the CMA comes in to say, based on what this home offers, this is really where the threshold is, factoring in appreciation, all those things, to say, and allows us as realtors to advise that once you get to a certain point, you're really starting to maybe overspend. But to your point, Carie, a house is worth whatever someone's willing to pay for it. So it does tie right back into what you need and possibly what you want and what you can afford. So that's where price escalations are coming in. We're dealing with a lot of cash out there, which I'm curious to get your thoughts on that. Todd, and we got a question on when is an appraisal not necessary. So we'll come back to that since we're talking price. But ultimately, at the end of the day, to put a bow on that is understanding your budget and what you're comfortable with. And that may change neighborhood, home to home. But that's why we're running those CMAs to help people understand once you get to 6.25, you can actually get this much more house or an extra bedroom or a finished basement. So this is probably where you may want to halt things. And sometimes people go above that and sometimes they don't.
yeah. And where we're talking about offer hierarchy, right? Because we're talking about, winning the bidding war. Cash is king. Always. Now, it wasn't as much king when the rates were 2%, right? Because people just wanted to, get loans because money was so cheap. But the reason, Char, that cash is king is because of the appraisal. So if a buyer and a seller come together on a price and everybody's happy, and then the buyer has a lender, right? And I'm going to ask Todd to explain this specifically. The lender is going to hire an appraiser, right? Because the appraiser wants to make sure that we're going to be the values in line. And the appraiser has a completely different idea of what the value of the home should be. And the whole deal gets disrupted because of the appraisal view. So that's when an appraisal is needed, when there is a loan. With a cash buyer, there's no appraisal required. So it's a much less risky move for a seller. I mean, and we'll have you weigh in on this, Todd, in a second. But Chris, like, the two of us, like, we've talked about this, sometimes the person that wins the bidding war is the cash offer, even if the offer is less than other offers, because of the financing piece that could be attached to other offers, because the goal would be to get it to closing as soon as possible with the less road bumps along the way. And so, Todd, if you could explain a little bit about the appraisal and why it's required when there's a loan, and why sometimes the appraisal gets waived.
Right. So this has been a little bit of a trend over the last, probably starting in 2019. So Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, who own a little more than 82% of loans in the country, have a pretty good idea of what each and every neighborhood in the United States looks like value-wise, because they can look down upon them from space and say, oh, these houses sold at this price. So by running a file through what they call the automated underwriting system, which would be everything that is essentially conventional, this would not include jumbos, FHAs likely, and VAs likely. They can say, oh, this is a low risk purchase. We're not going to require the appraisal to be done. So the question is always, how often does that happen? Well, they have the opportunity in our world to kind of dial it in like a radio station whenever they want to either make it more difficult or less difficult when it comes to doing appraisal. And we see a significance with purchases right now coming through. If somebody's putting down typically 20% or more, where we get the bypass on the appraisal altogether. And let me be honest about that, though, that is our opportunity to say to the agent, hey, this is a choice do you want to do the appraisal or do you not want to do the appraisal and have that conversation with your client? It's not for me to decide that. It's for the agent to be able to decide that with their client, whether they want to go through that or not for any specific strategy or reason. But that is kind of what's trending. We are probably seeing the trend of something much greater than this as we go into the next 6-7 years, where we'll probably see much more appraisals coming back not necessary because of the high values we have. So any little declines in certain areas of the country are not going to require them anymore, most likely. So that is definitely a benefit that is starting to occur in the housing world right now. And you get into the jumbo loans, you get above 750,000. Some banks may not require it if you put down 30 or 40%, but because those loans are being serviced by the banks they choose to get the loan with, they make the decision to whether or not you'll do appraisal or not. Does that answer your question? Are we there?
She might be on mute. I would think.
Okay.
Great question though. And these are the things that, of course we live and breathe and we take for granted sometimes, but these are really important considerations when you're jumping into a bidding war, when you are a buyer. How can you compete? How can you win that boxing match? So I think for the remainder of the time, let's just kind of dive into that. Let's talk a little bit about just, I'm an anecdotal learner. So I usually, when I hear an example of something, that's when it really shines through for me. So maybe we can get some examples. Chris, and even Stacy, if you want to jump in on when we've had successful buyer winning bidding wars and what that looks like.
Yep.
Do you have any good examples up your sleeve that you want to chat about, Chris?
Well, and I think just for maybe people that are thinking about entering the market, it's understanding, and we can send as a follow-up to this with the recording, basically a pick list of all the things that are basically like a yes or no option in your offer. Of course, you have to put a price, you have to put when you're going to close, like there's the non-negotiables, but then there's all these other little things that you can throw in, and we'll save a couple expert tips for the end. They're actually not reinventing the wheel in any way, but they're just good small reminders that I've written down on the side. But I will send to clients, especially in competitive neighborhoods. Let's use my neighborhood in Mill Creek as an example, or Tanglewood and Batavia as an example, where the demand is so extremely high and has been since the neighborhood's inception. And right now at the height of the market, that here are the 8 things that I highly recommend that you're going to need to include. And whether or not the buyer chooses to include them is up to them and their comfort level and them talking with each other. But the key is obviously price. And one big piece that's worked is in most cases, a price escalation is allowable. And obviously still fits within the means of that pre-approval given to them by the lender, if not cash. And it allows you to escalate by really any dollar amount that you want over the next highest and best offer up until your max. We do sometimes see other buyer agents put out uncapped price escalations so that they can guarantee they're the first phone call and find out what the number is to win the house. That to me is a little bit interesting and puts a lot of risk out there, and just kind of sets your buyers up maybe to fail, as much as it feels like they're going to win. But the price escalation is a big piece of that. And then obviously switching gears to the terms. The terms are huge, and we just were talking about appraisals. And so I've seen more than ever, and I highly recommend on most homes, if we're going to be escalating well over list price, there's 5+ offers, just using things at a high level, that buyers include an appraisal gap addendum. And this is basically you as a buyer committing that if there is that gap Carie and Todd just spoke on of $10,000, $20,000, $50,000 between the purchase price and the appraiser's view, you're willing to cover a certain chunk of that, either all of it, some of it, $1,000, $50,000, everywhere in between. I've had clients being willing to cover every penny, and that's sometimes $50,000, $60,000 in an appraisal gap. So Todd, do you want to speak to that a little bit and how that works from your view?
Yeah, no, boy, oh boy, is that a hot topic, because a couple of things that people need to be aware of when they're starting to buy a house is, number one, we've not been in this significant of a volatility in market conditions in a very long time, specifically interest rates, right? So if someone is pre-approving you for a interest rate of whatever, the communication is forever necessary, because interest rates shift so dramatically day to day that it does affect affordability, or it creates affordability for you. So the key is that whoever your lender partner may be, you want to make sure they're going above the market wherever they're dealing with interest rates for pre-approval. That way, the client is understanding they're accepting of that payment if the interest rate happens to be that high, right? So very important. And also understanding the fact that it's the responsibility of that lender to also assure that there's enough assets they're going to meet the necessary commitment to do that appraisal gap, right? Because so many people want to do appraisal gaps, but they don't have the money to do it because they don't quite understand what the appraisal gap actually means sometimes.
Right.
I think those two things are really a skill-based thing that you should insist on the lender partner having, because if the file is not set up right, or the pre-approval is not set up right, or the commitment to underwrite is not set up correctly, then it puts you as the agent or the client in a position to where it's going to fail.
Right.
We want to make sure that you're walking into a circumstance where you can actually follow through and make assurances that if in fact they choose you, you can get it done. Does that make sense?
100%. And that's a big conversation that I have with lenders all the time of, is this, Todd, is this based on the assets, all the things you're seeing for client John Doe, is this something that you feel is low risk, and we don't have a guarantee. We don't know what the appraiser is going to do. Did they get rear-ended on the way to the appraisal? We just don't know what their mindset is going into that appointment. That's 20 to 30 minutes. That makes a huge factor on the contract staying together. But we can, based on property values and where the list price may be, we can feel confident, although we can never guarantee. And I know, and you could speak to this better, Todd, as well, is that appraisal gaps feel a little less risky if you're bringing 30, 40% to, your down payment, because you can ultimately not have to bring $25,000 in cash to cover that gap. It really could just be folded into your loan and just change that loan to value, which makes things a little bit smoother.
100%. Just if somebody has down 20% or more, even in some instances, 10 or 15%, as long as they're willing and accepting what the payment looks like in worst case scenario, then it's something we can move forward with. It's always creating an expectation for the client that's going to be factual versus hypothetical.
Right. 100%.
Yeah.
And then touching on the other two key components, and there's many more, but for sake of time, as is has become a clause that I absolutely despise, but it's just necessary, especially in multiple offers, because everyone else is doing it. And it's one extra set of initials. But with as is, the question we always get is, can I still get the home inspected? Absolutely. You're still going to have the home inspection, although I'm seeing some people, even after telling them don't do it, waiving inspections. It's a much riskier play, and you could be running into a complete, Carie hates waiving inspections. I do too. But as is a little less risky. And honestly, I think there's just as much risk for the seller as there is for the buyer, because if the inspection comes back poor, and the buyer is either going to ask for things anyways, and the seller can walk and hope that one of the backup offers is still around, or the buyer is going to do the inspection, feel like they can't really ask for anything due per the contract, and just walk away altogether rather than even ask. So it is one that is necessary. It makes the seller feel like, I'm not going to get $1,000, $2,000 in addition to what you're telling me you're going to pay me. They want their money. They want the least amount of risk possible. But really, a conversation for a whole other day is still, to me, pretty risky as a seller if you accept it. And then the flexibility on when you take possession of the home kind of goes back, Todd, you talked about being able to close a loan in 15 days. I've looked at 3 properties just in the MLS this morning. All 3 of them said seller prefers quick close and rent back and hanging on to the home, because they want their money to go shop for their next home.
That's right.
And so this time of year in the summer months, it's very common to sellers that want a quick close. And if you're not cash, sometimes it can be tough to get a loan done in less than 20 days if you haven't gone through the front end process and getting you as the lender everything you need to help them. But also you need that flexibility to be a buyer, because the seller's asking for it 75+% of the time.
Right.
So that's going to be a huge I see seller's choice on more offers that we've written than not, as opposed to putting a date in. And then it's multiple conversations with the listing agent on when it's best for the seller, and the buyer just kind of has to put up with it if they want the house.
You know what, that's exactly right. And what it filters right back to is what we first started talking about was communication, right? Because selling is not telling, it's asking good questions. And I know as a listing agent, right, and we know as a listing agent, when you have a buyer's agent that's calling you saying, hey, what's important to your client? What is the seller most wanting throughout this transaction, right? And if we know some of those intangibles, then we are much better able to help the buyer win that bidding war, because we have information, and knowledge is power, right? And some, you know, we've lost 40,000 licensed realtors last month. The National Association of Realtors came out and said that we had the first net negative agent loss in a decade. And I think a big piece of that is because agents thought they just come in, you know, they're texting, they're sending emails, they're writing offers without any communication. And that's a real disservice to the public, because it takes both sides. And so if the buyer's agent knows what's important to the seller, they're gonna have a much better time getting their offer accepted, because it's two pieces in this market. It's price, like Chris said, price and terms. Price and terms. And you sometimes could win on terms if you lose on price, but most of the time you kind of have to have both pieces of that puzzle super sharp. And if you're missing the boat on something as simple as making a phone call, I remember a home that I sold in Batavia, we had a bidding war on, and it was getting aggressive. And the buyer actually came through to the open house, really lovely gal. She was actually being represented by her boss, who was an agent in the city. And he came in and never talked to me. He just wrote the offer. I called him to let him know we were going into a bidding war, and he was real crabby about it. And he ended up writing, he said, well, we're going to get this. We're going to get this offer like done for sure. And his big thing was that he wrote it as is. That was the thing that he thought was going to make his buyer get the house. And I had to chuckle, because had he done his homework or asked me questions, he would have realized that it was new construction. Like, you didn't need, it was basically as is. Like, that did not help his buyer at all. It really didn't give him any competitive advantage, because we didn't need an as is term, and when I called him to tell him he lost the bidding war, he was shocked. Right. And I said, well, you should have done your homework. You should have found out what was really important to the seller, which was a super short closing date. And the person that won that bidding war got it figured out. Right. So you just have to really know what those little key trigger points are to the seller, and make sure you're ready to, to bridge that gap. So it's more critical than ever in this market, wouldn't you say?
100%. And I think three last little pro tips that can help get an offer accepted. One is based on price and that price escalation. What I'm finding is, and this is, pro tip for our agents as well. So if they're competing with me on homes in the future, they're going to know. But the escalation, a lot of buyers out there are having conversations with their lender, also with their realtor. How high should we go? How high should we go? Let's say the house is listed at $500,000. There's 6 offers. Well, somebody's probably in those 6 offers willing to pay more than 500. So let's say they're willing to pay, they say, Chris, we're willing to pay 520 for the house. A lot of other people may be saying, let's do 520, let's do 520. What I've encouraged on price escalations is to come up just a few $1,000s higher than what you ultimately think you would. And the question we typically ask is, say, Todd, if someone gets the house for 525, will you be mad? No. Okay, but if somebody got the house for 521, would you be mad? Yes. Okay, then let's offer 523 just to be a little bit off and kind of an odd number on our escalation. And I've actually had multiple offers accepted this year because the next highest offer was right at that flat 5,000 or 10,000 number, and we were just sneaking just past it. So that's one pro tip. The other is love letters. They're still allowed, and they actually do still work. I wrote an offer on my house with a love letter, and I think it had a big influence into it getting accepted. And sellers are emotional too. And because sellers are staying in their homes longer, living in their homes longer, and in this area, we don't have the stat in front of us of, average tenure in a home in Kane County, but you better believe in older communities in St. Charles, you have sellers that have been there 30, 40, 50 years, and they really do value the people that are moving in and buying their home. And so there's no dollar amount to a love letter, but I think it can be worth thousands if it's done right and it's presented the right way. And then lastly, getting the lender involved. Too many offers we see coming in on our listings and that we see buyers submit have no mention of the lender. The lender's not included in the process. And so for us to be able to copy the lender on the email, the best lenders out there, Todd and his team especially, will call the listing agent to ensure them that they've done their homework on the client. And sometimes even just an email coming over the top to outline, their assets and their qualifications and strength as buyers can go a long, long way in creating, again, that sense of low risk to the seller and certainly the listing agent as well. So those are just a couple quick pro tips to leave us with. But looking ahead, back half of the year, we talk about this, and the market starts to slow down after 4th of July, which can be ultimately, depending on your situation, a great time to be a buyer. Todd, any future predictions on the fall market? Carie, I'm curious to get your thoughts as well. We see a lot of seasonality happen at this time of year, and it can be a great time to get, let's call it a deal on a home. But Todd, you first, any predictions on where you see the market going as the economy shifts and all that good stuff?
Well, I think that we will see certainly a significant shift in interest rates and inflation numbers going down, which is hopefully going to bring down cost in some areas and create more affordability for the buyer opportunities. I think that we're a little early in forecasting a whole lot of change. I mean, I think most of our change is probably going to come towards spring and latter half of next year, moving into 2024, because there's a lot of things going on in our world right now. And when you get the geoeconomics of everything working together, certain things are having cause and effect on things we don't even understand where it's coming from. So I would say is, the skill and the education are very important, but most importantly is the communication with one another to understand what's it going to look like going forward, because daily it seems to change right now, to be honest with you.
Yeah, it's true. And you know what? It is really hard to predict, but I think the most important thing is it's individualistic on what's the best time to buy, what's the best time to sell. We always say, like, let's put all the pieces of the puzzle on the table. And if it forms a really pretty picture, right, like, then it could be go time. But it's our job to make sure we're filling in every single piece of that puzzle, or getting all the ingredients together to make a really lovely meal. And without that, right, then it could be troublesome. So we are just here to educate and inform and keep you guys in the know on everything, and just have an open dialogue with some fun. We're going to keep doing these. So I appreciate all of you being on this call today. We had a ton of fun. We didn't really know real winners on this, but I think if I had to go toe to toe with Wallace, I think I'd win. We'll find out next time. Tune in. We're going to do this again next month. And if any of you guys have any specific you want to chat about, give us a holler. We're always around. We're always home for you. And
Yeah.
you guys have a great day.